Hi, I'm Shay.
And I'm Heather.
Welcome back to day 3 of the series. Today we're talking about boundaries. Now, in our last video, Heather, you were talking a lot about understanding what's okay, what's not okay, what's a boundary, what's something that I just need to put a hard stop to when it comes to shadow work and things like that. And we're going to cover those questions, but first we want to share a few things that are really important to know about boundaries. Okay, so before we even get to setting boundaries, we really need to understand the root. So most of us either have a hard time setting boundaries at all, or we are over boundaried, which means that we have a really tall wall around our heart. So either we might have like a bit of a doormat tendency, or will be impossible to reach. Now, these are usually stemming from fear. So the root of all boundary issues is fear. Okay, so we can't just go right to the tips and strategies for how to set a boundary if we don't understand the hidden fears underneath our boundary issues in the first place. Okay, so if we have a hard time setting boundaries, if we have a hard time speaking our truth, saying no, speaking up for ourselves, often what's behind that is a real fear of being abandoned, fear that we won't be loved, or fear that somebody is going to say no and take away their love. Okay, now if we have really tall walls around our heart, if it's really hard for people to reach us, if we're what we call overly guarded, usually there's a fear of being controlled, a fear of being hurt, a fear of being manipulated in some way. And so whether you relate to having what we would call rigid boundaries, which is like really guarded heart, or if you would relate more to the porous boundaries, which is being under-boundaried, we're going to work on coming to a state of flexible boundaries, which is listening to yourself and honoring yourself in your highest form. If you think boundaries are all about saying no, if you think boundaries are all about keeping people away, you couldn't be further from the truth. And here's the best part. Boundaries are actually designed to keep the right people in, to make life more pleasurable, to make life more in flow. So boundaries are about learning to say yes to what feels good. Boundaries are a byproduct of when you're in tune with yourself, when you're not letting your fear run the show. So we talked a lot in the shadow work video about holding back parts of ourselves, about wearing that mask. And this is where boundaries come in. So this is why it kind of flows perfectly within this whole series, because really, ultimately, what we're learning to do is trust ourselves, to trust that our needs and our desires are important and they're valuable and they deserve to be respected. So rather than holding ourselves back or thinking that we need to just take what we can get in relationship or in work or in our family, we start to really stand up for what feels good for us, what feels soul fulfilling. And that's what boundaries are about. It's not about saying no all the time. I mean, sure, we need to learn how to say no if we want to be in our power. But the most beautiful part about it all is learning when it feels right to say yes. And when you feel like you're in tune with your body, when you understand and trust yourself on that deeper level, you can finally begin to say yes more than you say no, because the opportunities flowing to you are in alignment with what it is that you want to create in your life.
So as we grow with shadow work, as we grow with learning our boundaries will actually start to grow and change with us. What we might have thought was a healthy boundary before, we might actually see was coming purely from a place of fear. It was coming from a place of defensiveness and self-protection. But we can't see that until we've actually gone inward to understand where our traumas originally came from in the first place. Ultimately, boundaries are you being self-honoring towards yourself. What feels good for me in my process right now? So what might feel good and safe for me right now as I do my shadow work, as I do my healing with people, that might change. Maybe I'll feel safer within myself, and so my boundaries will start to become a little bit more flexible and less rigid. But really at the end of the day, your boundaries are always going to be yours and another person's are going to be theirs. Just because you're in relationship with someone doesn't mean that your boundaries are always going to align. And that can feel really challenging when you're setting a boundary with someone and they have a completely different version of reality or what their needs are. We often go into this sort of battle of I'm right, you're wrong. We're fighting for position. We're trying to fight to feel safe. But what we need to recognize is that we're both wanting to feel safe. We're both fighting for the same thing. And sometimes that looks different. So we need to look at compromise in relationship, so clear communication. How can I honor your boundaries while you honor mine? And if that's not possible, sometimes looking at creating some space. So if something is self-honoring for you and another person in your life isn't able to meet you there, it could be healthy for you to actually move away from that relationship. And that's where we also need to look at, is this actually abusive? If it's physically or psychologically or emotionally abusive, then of course you don't stay there. That's not a place to do your shadow work. We're always about doing what's actually healthy and safe for you. So that might be a relationship that you need to move away from. And if that's the case, if that's what's self-honoring for you, you need to trust your heart. Sometimes relationships come to an end because we have something that we need to learn. And that ending can be one of the greatest teachers that you ever experience, especially if it means that you're honoring your own heart.
We never give two people the same feedback, and that's because each of us has such an individual path. What's right for me might be completely different for Heather, and our relationship patterns and our paths in relationship are so different. And so what's important is that you understand your own patterns so that you know what your work is, okay? So when it comes to boundaries, for some of us, our growth's edge might be staying in the game and using our voice. And for others, it might be learning to walk away. So there's no one way to approach this. You have to be able to tune into yourself and know what your work really is. So if we are carrying around this story that people will leave, that we aren't lovable, that people will abandon us, then we might have a really hard time using our voice. And in that, our growth's edge is speaking up for ourselves. It's maybe perhaps getting in touch with our anger, bringing a bit of our edge, bringing our fire, letting other people see that in relationship. Whereas if we always lead with anger, if we feel much more comfortable in our fire, but we don't feel exactly safe to show our vulnerability or let people into our inside world of sadness or shame, all of that stuff that we carry, then there might be some learning for us to do in allowing people to hold space for us and allowing people to show up for us fully. Okay, so whether we have really high walls or whether we are letting people walk all over us because we're afraid to say no, the work is going to be slightly different, but it's all ultimately about connecting to our fear and then learning how to love and accept ourselves in those hard to love places, because ultimately that's the pathway to getting into right relationship with yourself and being able to truly love another person. And again, not just romantic relationships. And this has been so helpful for me in my family relationships, so helpful for Heather and I in our work together, and so helpful for me in all of my close friendships. This is really about being able to feel free and happy in how you live your life.
So sometimes when we're first learning how to set boundaries, we can kind of take it to an extreme. So that might look like demands or ultimatums, and that's never going to work. When you're setting a boundary and you present it as a demand or ultimatum, you're basically shutting that other person out. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about the difference between what a demand, an ultimatum, and a healthy boundary is?
Well, you touched on a really good point, and that is that sometimes we think what is a boundary, but it's really a demand. And what that means is that I am expecting you to do or behave a specific way in order for us to continue in the relationship. And that doesn't generally work, okay? So, for example, a boundary might be, hey, in order for me to be in clear relationship, I really need open communication. So if you're going to be seeing anybody else while we're dating, I would like to know so that I have a choice whether or not I want to move forward or not, okay? Now that's a boundary that absolutely deserves to be respected and honored. Or if it's not, then the relationship probably isn't something that you want to continue with. Now, a demand would be something like, you're not allowed to go out tonight with your friends because I want to spend time with you and I don't want you to go and hang out with that person anymore. You see the difference. One is really based in control. It's really rooted in fear. And the other, when we're saying, hey, this is what I need in order to feel safe, this is more of a request. And that's ultimately what boundaries are. They're basically a request in relationship. So the other person never has to honor your boundaries. They actually don't have to comply at all. But what that gives you is information on whether or not the two of you can actually move forward or whether it's just not a match. So when we're setting boundaries, we really want to tune in. We want to say, okay, does this feel like it's coming from fear? Does this feel like it's something about control? Does this feel like I'm just trying to get the other person to validate me in some way? And if the answer is yes, that's likely not a healthy boundary. That's more of a demand or an ultimatum, and it's coming from your own fear or anxiety. Okay, so a healthy boundary will actually allow you both to grow in intimacy together and to feel more connected, not separate.
Essentially, boundaries are a clarifying dance in your life, in your relationships, and what works for you and what doesn't. And it's going to be a constant evolution. It's never going to stay the same. And sometimes that dance that we're doing with someone, the moves just aren't working out. Things just aren't aligning. And we have to respect and honor that what works for one person might not work for you and might not work for another. And really what we need to do is use boundaries as a way to see what's right for us, what's not, and get into alignment with our own personal truth.
Okay, so one of my boundaries in my relationship is that I really need open communication and I need focused time to feel and see my partner. So what that means to me is having focused time every week where we can just sit in front of each other and clear our minds and share anything that's on our heart, anything that maybe is keeping us separate from one another, anything that has upset us about our behavior throughout the week, any internal conflicts that we might be feeling, or any needs that we would like to have met. Now, that doesn't mean that every need is going to be perfectly met. It doesn't mean that we're always going to entirely agree. And the truth is that sometimes we don't actually have anything that we really need to clear. But it's so important to me because that's what allows me to feel connected and safe. And so my partner allows us to have that time. So communication is a big boundary for me. I don't feel like I can actually be in a healthy relationship without flowing lines of communication. And you see how this is a really healthy ask. There's no demand in there, there's no fear in there. It's just something that I need in order to feel and flow in life.
So what Shalina was just talking about is not only a healthy boundary, but a positive, affirming, healing request in her relationship. And part of that is Shalina obviously getting to know what her non-negotiables are in relationship, what she needs to feel safe, happy, met, loved, cared for, and to have that energy being reciprocated between her and her partner. And so when we look at boundaries, we don't have to look at them specifically as a wall. So something negative, don't do this. Boundaries can actually be, here's how you can meet me. This is what I need. This is what works for me and my life to truly be self-honoring. So non-negotiables, requests, and boundaries can actually all dance together.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so true. When I first started dating my partner, Ben, I actually wrote out a list. So I wrote out a list of all of the things that I was personally working on. So I said, hey, I know that this isn't your responsibility, but here are some of the wounds that I'm working on healing right now. And I'm doing that work to heal. And here are some things that I could hear from you, and here are some of the things that I need as a supportive relationship. So I wrote out all of the things that I wanted, I wrote out all of the things that I needed, including things that I needed to hear, and then I made requests about here's how I want the relationship to look. And here are the things that I want to know about if we're going to move forward. And I also said to him, hey, it's totally okay if you can't meet this request. If this isn't in flow with what you want, that's okay. Just let me know and we can take a shift. But I just need to clarify these things for myself so I know how to proceed. And in that, he showed up fully and he met all of my requests, and he told me the things that I asked to hear to feel safe. And part of that was because he felt like he didn't have to take care of me. He didn't feel like I was asking to be saved. I was simply sharing where I was at and also giving him information on how to love me better. And that's really what a boundary is all about. If we're in right relationship with each other, we want to know, what are your boundaries? What are my boundaries? So we can love each other better, not so that we can be separate.
And here's the deal. Shay wouldn't have been able to do any of that had she not done the work of shadow work and understanding conscious relationship, because Shalina had accepted these parts of herself. She knew that her requests were actually okay, and where she was at, even if she was struggling with something, that was okay too. So she was able to bring that to her partner and actually have her needs met. So she was taking self-responsibility in her relationship and in her reality and taking a stand for what she truly wanted in her life. And of course, you had amazing results. But that came from her self-acceptance, that came from her self-love. And so that's really what we're weaving through between all three of these videos, is teaching you how to understand what a conscious relationship is, how to integrate with the shadow work, and how to set healthy, beautiful boundaries in your life.
Totally. And here's the other thing that came into play with all of that. I was drawing a line in the sand. I did not have time to waste. I had been through that song and dance where I didn't show up fully, where I hadn't owned my own shadow, and I saw where that took me in relationship. And as you know, it was very painful. It was really, really difficult. And so I had gone to this place in my own life and in this work where I realized, you know what? I actually want something different. I really want to be in conscious relationship. I want somebody who's going to see all of me and love me. So I just threw it all out on the table. I was like, here's who I am. Here's what I've got going on. Here's what I want. Here's what I need. And here's how I want to show up for you. And if that doesn't feel good, then that's great. We can be friends. We can do whatever, but we're not going to do this. And his opportunity was to either say yes or no to that. So in a way, I was giving him this grand opportunity to claim what felt right for him as well. And I think that when we get to that place where we really know who we are and what we want, it's so much easier to set boundaries, because we're no longer worried about the people who say no or who can't meet us, because we don't need everybody to show up and meet us. We just need the right people to show up and meet us. And I promise you that when it's right, they will. You won't have to force it. You won't have to push somebody or convince anybody to show up for you. The person who's meant to show up for you, whether that's your friend, whether that's your partner, they will want to do so wholeheartedly. Let go of the idea that you need to convince anybody to be any other way than what they are. And just allow yourself to step fully into what feels true for you.
Thank you so much for that. Even I felt moved, and I'm sure everyone else felt moved from your share just now. You know, this is really powerful work, and we can't wait to share more with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
If you resonated with this work and you feel ready and willing to go deeper, we're gonna make sure that you have access to our offerings in your email. So check your inbox for a link to take you to risingwoman.com, where you can visit all of our offerings and see what we have for you in terms of programs and workshops.